Welcome back to Flagstone Trail. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Law 22 of Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power.
Use the surrender tactic. Transform weakness into power.
Now this one sounds a little bit counterintuitive, I think.
It is. It's one of the more, shocking laws in the book when people first read it.
Yeah, definitely. So when we think of surrender, we usually think of giving up completely. But this law is saying something a bit different.
Right. It's not about weakness. It's about a calculated yielding, a strategic retreat, if you will.
So instead of meeting force with force, sometimes it's wiser to step back.
Exactly. It's about choosing your battles, recognizing that sometimes retreating can actually put you in a stronger position in the long run.
And that's what this law is all about, transforming weakness into power by strategically surrendering.
Precisely. To really illustrate this concept, let's look at a historical example where surrender, or the lack thereof, had very drastic consequences.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
Let's go back to ancient Greece. The Peloponnesian War, Athens, a dominant naval power, was clashing with the island of Melos.
Melos, a Spartan colony? If I remember correctly.
You've got it. The Athenians being the pragmatic bunch that they were offered the Melians a choice: surrender and become our ally, or face destruction.
So basically join us or die.
More or less. They even argued that resistance was futile, stating that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must.
That sounds pretty ruthless.
Oh, it was. But that was the reality of power politics back then. And to some extent, even now, sentimentality often takes a backseat to strategic considerations.
So what did the Melians do faced with such a stark choice?
Well, against the advice of those who urged them to surrender, they chose to resist. They clung to their sense of honor and hoped for Spartan aid.
So a gamble based on principle and a hope for outside help.
Exactly. And sadly for them, it was a gamble that didn't pay off. The Athenians saw their defiance as pointless and ultimately crushed them.
A tragic end. But I guess it highlights the dangers of clinging to pride when you're clearly outmatched.
Precisely. The Melians, despite their courage, paid a heavy price for failing to recognize the strategic advantage of surrender.
So sometimes holding on to your principles in the face of overwhelming odds can lead to disastrous results.
Yes. And that's why this law is so crucial. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about strength and weakness.
It seems there are times when yielding is actually the smarter move.
Exactly. It's about knowing when to fight and when to strategically surrender to ultimately achieve your goals.
Which brings up an important question. How do we differentiate between genuine defeat and strategic surrender? Where do we draw the line?
That's where discernment comes in. Strategic surrender is never about giving up on your values or goals entirely.
So it's not about completely abandoning your cause.
No, it's about recognizing when direct confrontation would only lead to more losses and choosing a different path.
So strategically retreating to fight another day.
You could say that it's about biding your time and waiting for a more favorable opportunity.
So it's about transforming that perceived weakness into a strategic advantage.
Absolutely. It's about using that period of apparent weakness to analyze your opponent, gather strength, and plot your next move.
Sort of like the Trojan horse tactic. Appearing defeated while secretly planning your comeback.
A brilliant analogy. The idea is to lull your opponent into a false sense of security, making them overconfident and less vigilant.
Which then creates an opening for you to regain your footing.
Precisely. And potentially even turn the tables completely.
So we've seen how this seemingly passive approach can actually be quite cunning and powerful.
It's a classic example of using deception and strategy to achieve your aims.
Now, let's shift gears from ancient Greece to a more modern setting. Can you give us an example of how this law played out in a different context?
Absolutely. Let's fast forward to 1940s America, the McCarthy era.
A time of political paranoia and blacklisting.
You got it! The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was pursuing suspected communists, particularly in Hollywood.
And as we know, many artists and writers were caught in that net.
Indeed. One of the figures summoned before the committee was Bertolt Brecht, the renowned playwright.
Bertolt Brecht, a known Marxist, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Now, many of his peers chose to confront HUAC head-on, refused to cooperate, challenged their tactics.
They became known as the Hollywood 10, I believe.
Exactly. And their defiance came at a great cost. Many were blacklisted, their careers effectively ruined.
A stark reminder of the price of dissent during those times.
It was Brecht, however, took a different approach. He understood that outright defiance in that climate would be self-destructive.
So instead of confronting the committee head-on, he chose to
surrender. But strategically, of course.
Wait, Brecht, the famously outspoken playwright, chose to play along with HUAC? I'm intrigued. Tell me more about his approach.
Well, instead of engaging in heated arguments, he appeared cooperative, even congenial.
So he put on a show.
You could say that he cleverly feigned submission to the committee's authority, answered their questions in a way that seemed compliant but was actually subtly subversive.
A masterclass in calculated deception.
Indeed. He even used an interpreter despite being fluent in English. This allowed him to introduce subtle ambiguities in his responses, further obfuscating his true intentions.
That's incredibly clever. By appearing to surrender, he disarmed the committee, avoided direct confrontation, and ultimately outsmarted them.
Precisely.
This really highlights the potential power of Law 22.
It does. Brecht's example beautifully illustrates how a seeming surrender can be used to deflect aggression by time and ultimately protect yourself from a more powerful adversary.
It's a stark contrast to the fate of the Melians. Instead of succumbing to the pressure, Brecht used strategic surrender to navigate a treacherous political landscape.
And emerged relatively unscathed.
And that's the key takeaway here. Strategic surrender isn't about weakness.
It's about transforming a position of weakness into an opportunity for cunning maneuvering.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the most effective way to win is to appear to lose.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most effective way to win is to appear to lose.
This is making me rethink how I approach conflict in general. Maybe sometimes stepping back, reassessing the situation, and choosing a more strategic approach is the smarter move, even if it means temporarily swallowing my pride.
That's a valuable insight. Too often we react instinctively driven by ego or a desire to prove ourselves. But as Law 22 reminds us sometimes, the most powerful move is the one that appears the most yielding.
I'm eager to delve deeper into the practical applications of this law, especially in a modern workplace context. But perhaps that's a discussion for another segment.
Indeed, let's explore those real-world scenarios next.
So we've established that strategic surrender can be incredibly powerful, even in high-stakes situations, like facing a congressional committee. But let's bring this down to earth a bit. How can we apply this law in our everyday lives, especially in the workplace?
Excellent question. Imagine you're in a meeting where your idea is met with resistance, even outright criticism. Your instinct might be to defend your idea tooth and nail.
Oh, absolutely. I've definitely been there, feeling that urge to dig in and prove myself right.
But consider this. What if instead of engaging in a heated debate, you strategically surrender?
Surrender? How would that even work in that kind of situation?
Not by abandoning your idea entirely, but by acknowledging the concerns and suggesting you revisit it, taking the feedback into account.
So instead of getting defensive, I could say something like, I appreciate the feedback. Let me take another look at this and see how I can address your concerns.
Exactly. This demonstrates that you're receptive to feedback, not stubbornly attached to being right. It also buys you valuable time to strategize, gather more information, or perhaps even win over some allies to support your revised approach.
So it's like a strategic retreat, allowing you to regroup and plan your next move.
Yeah.
It also avoids damaging your relationships with colleagues by engaging in unnecessary conflict.
Precisely. Now, let's say you're dealing with a micromanaging boss, someone who seems to relish controlling every aspect of your work. Direct confrontation might not be the most effective strategy in this case.
Well, I know the type.
Yeah.
Resisting them directly often feels like a losing battle.
That's where a more subtle form of strategic surrender, what Robert Greene calls overobedience, can come into play.
Overobedience? That sounds almost paradoxical. How did that work?
Imagine your boss insists on approving every single email before you send it. Instead of complaining or arguing, you take their demand to an extreme, sending them drafts of even the most mundane messages for their approval.
So I'd be inundating them with requests for approval, even for emails, like out for lunch back at 1 or see you at the meeting.
Precisely. By taking their control to an absurd level, you're subtly highlighting the ridiculousness of their micromanagement. It's a passive form of resistance that can be surprisingly effective.
It's like you're holding up a mirror to their behavior, forcing them to see the absurdity of it. And the beauty is they can't really get mad at you because you're technically just following their instructions.
Exactly. This approach can also work in other situations where you're dealing with unreasonable demands or expectations. By complying to an exaggerated degree, you expose the flaws in their logic and potentially even compel them to reconsider their approach.
It's a brilliant way to leverage the power of strategic surrender without appearing to be defiant or insubordinate. It's about playing the game on a different level.
And that's the beauty of this law. It encourages us to think outside the box, to find creative solutions to challenging situations, and to recognize that sometimes the most effective approach is the one that appears the most yielding.
Now, you mentioned earlier that strategic surrender isn't limited to interpersonal conflict. It can also apply to broader situations like cultural adaptation. Can you elaborate on that?
Of course. Consider Japan in the mid-19th century. When Western powers began exerting their influence, Japan found itself in a seemingly vulnerable position.
I can imagine facing a completely different culture. Technology and way of life must have been daunting.
Instead of resisting outright, which could have led to colonization or war, they chose a path of strategic surrender. They adopted Western elements, technology, military tactics, even fashion, while carefully preserving their own cultural core.
So they outwardly conformed while inwardly retaining their identity. That's fascinating.
It was a masterful display of Law 22. By appearing to yield to Western influence, they disarmed their perceived threat, gained access to valuable knowledge, and ultimately emerged as a major world power, all while maintaining their unique cultural identity.
It's like they used that period of seeming submission to learn, adapt, and ultimately strengthen their own position on the world stage.
Precisely. It's a powerful reminder that surrender, when employed strategically, can be a tool for not just survival, but also for growth and transformation.
This is giving me a whole new perspective on how to approach challenges, both personal and professional. It's about choosing my battles wisely, knowing when to push back and when to yield, and always keeping the long-term goal in mind.
That's the key takeaway here. Strategic surrender isn't about weakness. It's about recognizing that sometimes the path to victory lies in a calculated retreat, in biding your time, and ultimately in turning a perceived disadvantage into an opportunity for greater strength and success.
I'm starting to see surrender not as a sign of defeat, but as a powerful tool for achieving my goals. It's about choosing when to push and when to yield to ultimately get what you want.
Exactly. And that's the essence of this law transforming weakness into power.
This has been incredibly insightful. I'm feeling a lot less intimidated by the idea of surrender now. In fact, I'm starting to see it as a secret weapon.
It can be if used wisely and strategically. Now, before we wrap up our discussion on Law 22, there's one more powerful application of this law I'd like to touch upon.
Oh, I'm all ears. What else can we learn from this fascinating principle?
Yeah.
I'm all ears. What else can we learn from this fascinating principle?
Well, it's about something we all experience: personal relationships. Sometimes letting go of the need to be right to win every argument can actually be the most powerful move.
You mean choosing harmony over being right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a tough one, especially when you feel strongly about something.
It is. But think about it. How often do those battles of ego really achieve anything positive? They can escalate conflicts, damage relationships, and create unnecessary tension.
I see your point. It's about picking your battles, recognizing when it's more important to preserve the relationship than to win a point.
Exactly. Sometimes a strategic surrender in a personal relationship means choosing to listen, empathize, and find common ground, even if it means letting go of the need to have the last word.
So it's about choosing understanding and connection over being, right? That's a powerful shift in perspective.
It is. And it aligns perfectly with the core principle of Law 22, transforming a perceived weakness, in this case, the willingness to yield into a stronger relationship.
This law has given me a lot to think about, not just in terms of how I approach conflict, but also how I view power dynamics in general. It's not always about brute force or dominance. It's about understanding the nuances of situations and finding the most strategic path to achieve your goals.
And remember, like any of these laws, it's not about blind application. It's about understanding the principle, adapting it to your specific situation, and using it judiciously.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You have to be smart about it. But this whole idea of transforming weakness into power is so empowering.
It really is. It encourages us to see setbacks not as defeats, but as potential turning points. It reminds us that power isn't always about brute force. It's about adaptability, resilience, and knowing when to play the long game.
I think this law has given me a whole new set of tools for navigating not just the workplace, but life itself. It's about choosing my battles, wisely surrendering strategically, and always keeping that long-term vision in mind.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most powerful move is to take a step back, assess the situation, and then choose the path that leads to ultimate victory, even if it means surrendering along the way.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot less intimidated by the idea of surrender now. In fact, I'm starting to see it as a secret weapon.
It can be if used wisely, and that's the key takeaway here, understanding the power of strategic surrender.
And that's it for today's Flagstone Trail discussion on Law 22. Use the surrender tactic. We appreciate your listenership. Could there be an area in your life where strategic surrender might be the key to ultimately getting what you want? We encourage you to reflect on this question and apply the law's wisdom to your own situations. Until next time, keep those minds sharp, your strategies even sharper,